Hello, America. I'm Mark Levin, and this is Life, Liberty, and Levin. This is an incredibly important show. I have two very important guests, and my first guest is somebody you need to know. He's retired British Colonel Richard Kemp. Richard Kemp has spent most of his life fighting terrorism and insurgency, commanding British troops on the front line of some of the world's toughest hotspots, including Afghanistan, Iraq, the Balkans, and Northern Ireland. He was sent to Kabul in 2003 to take command of British forces in Afghanistan, which is exactly what he did. Writing about Richard, the Canadian general commanding international forces at the time said, his efforts led directly to the most successful offensive counter-terrorist operations in Kabul, with several key terrorist leaders under arrest, significantly setting back the enemy campaign. Now, in more recent years, he spent several of those years in Downing Street as head of the International Terrorism Team at the Joint Intelligence Committee, where he was responsible for producing assessments on the growing global terrorism problem for the Prime Minister at the time and the Cabinet. And in 2005, at the request of the U.S. Ambassador to Iraq, Colonel Kemp spent 3 months on a special intelligence assignment in Baghdad, Fallujah, and Mosul. And among his honors include Commander of the Order of the British Empire Military Division and Queen's Commendation for bravery. That sets the stage for our discussion. Colonel Kemp, how are you, sir?
I'm very well, Mark. Thank you very much, and it's a real pleasure to be with you.
Well, I wanted the American people to have a perspective from a commander on the ground who actually fought in Afghanistan about what you've seen taking place from Britain over the last week or so. From my perspective and the perspective of a lot of Americans, this is a complete humiliation and disaster and a complete surrender on the terms the Taliban have wanted. And I'm deeply concerned that this is what we call a tipping point in the decline of United States military power and the rise of the communist Chinese. Now, I've laid a lot out there. I would just like, first of all, your take on what you've seen.
I'd like to begin by saying I've fought alongside US forces in different places in the world. I have the greatest admiration and respect for the American Armed Forces. And anything I might say, any criticism I might make in relation to Afghanistan is not a criticism of the US forces. I think what we're seeing and what we've seen in the last few days it's the greatest foreign policy disaster that I have seen in my lifetime of any nature from any Western country. And I would go so far as to say that this is the most disastrous foreign policy event since at least the Second World War for the United States of America. It has unbelievable strategic consequences well beyond Afghanistan itself. And I think, people often compare Vietnam and Saigon in 1975 to the things they're seeing on the television now. I think it is worse than that, and it's very different to that. But it did take the American armed forces 15 years to recover from Saigon. It took them until the Gulf War in 1991. That's the scale of the disaster that they faced in 75, and I think it's, as I say, worse. And one of the reasons it's worse is because in Saigon and in Vietnam, the North Vietnamese were not trying to attack or destroy the United States of America. They were very much focused on that country, on Vietnam. And so when the US left, it left a failed strategy, a failed war in effect for a number of reasons, but it did not leave a war that it should have still been fighting. And in fact, in the situation in Kabul, the reason we were there was to prevent another 9/11, prevent another serious terrorist attack against the West from Afghanistan. And we succeeded in that in 20 years. But as we're leaving with ignominy, I think that threat remains, and it's re-energized the threat. I think the threat is worse now than it was before 9/11, the threat to the West. And not only that, But we've done exactly what Al-Qaeda wanted us to do on 9/11. They brought down the Twin Towers. They flew a plane into the Pentagon for one reason. So they wanted to lure the United States on 9/11. They brought down the Twin Towers. They flew a plane into the Pentagon for one reason. So they wanted to lure the United States into Afghanistan, where they would destroy the US forces and humiliate the US around the world. Well, it's 20 years later, but pretty much that's what they've achieved now. The American forces have not been destroyed, nor have they been defeated on the battlefield, but they have been humiliated by their president. And the whole of the United States of America and the Western world has also been humiliated. And it goes beyond that as well. The NATO alliance, our own defense secretary in Britain, said he attempted to cobble together a coalition of NATO states led by Britain without America to remain in Afghanistan. Nobody took his call. Now that says what NATO is. NATO is actually a paper tiger. It only is America. So when America pulls out, NATO is nowhere. And I think all of these things and many others have massive strategic implications for the world and for the US prestige and for all of the good the US has done in the world. That's been undermined by President Biden's catastrophic decision to withdraw unconditionally, without any regard to what's going on the ground or politically or in security terms, to unconditionally withdraw from the country of Afghanistan.
President Biden has trashed the Afghan soldiers. He's trashed the Afghan army. What do you say about that?
I think I would say that I've never heard such a disgraceful speech from the President of the United States of America as I heard the other day when he said the buck stops with me, but he then went on to explain how the buck actually stopped with everybody else. It wasn't him to blame, it was everybody else, starting from President Trump. And suggesting for one moment that he was bound or was forced to carry out a policy like this because of President Trump's policy is simply laughable, a pitiful excuse for what he did and what he's now being humiliated in. Because, he spent much of his early presidency reversing so many other things Trump did. He's been president for 7 months. He had a review of the situation in Afghanistan by his staff at the beginning of his presidency, and he was presented with various different options, one of which was the withdrawal that he's executed. But there were other options. He didn't have to take this option. So it's not President Trump's fault. It's not anyone else's fault. It is the fault of the President of the United States of America. And for that man to basically accuse Afghan forces of cowardice, a man who's never fought himself, I should add, for him to accuse the Afghans of cowardice, I think is a national disgrace for America. The Afghan National Security Forces have fought and died alongside American soldiers in Afghanistan and British soldiers. And 50,000 of them have been killed in action against the Taliban in the last 7 years. That is a phenomenal number. It dwarfs the casualties that we, Britain and America, took. And it's about 2/3 of the size of the current British Army. So for him to accuse them of not fighting and being cowards is absolutely shameful. And what he neglected to point out was that the reason that the Afghan National Security Forces collapsed is because he pulled the rug out from under their feet. They were doing most of the fighting in Afghanistan. Not the US Army, not the British Army, not the German Army. It was the Afghan Army that was doing most of the fighting and dying in Afghanistan. But they depended heavily on air support from the United States. They depended on technical support to keep their own aircraft flying, logistic support as well. And without that, they were far less capable of combat than they were with it. But even worse, even more serious, I believe, than that, was that the decision of the United States to leave Afghanistan, to abandon Afghanistan, was such a devastating blow to their morale. The US was their final guarantor of success, of not having their country taken over by the Taliban, and by not getting not being defeated themselves in battle by the Taliban. The Americans were their final backstop. When they went, Afghanistan forces morale just collapsed, and we saw the consequences of that. And the same applied really to the regional governors in the provincial capitals in Kabul, who themselves, they took stock. They realized the situation was different from what it was before, and they recognized that there was no chance really of survival on their own without the US. So many of them went over to the other side or ran away. So I think that's the reality of the situation. And I as a former soldier who's fought in Afghanistan and around the world, I just was horrified by President Biden's branding of the Afghan army as cowards.
When we come back, Colonel Kemp, several questions, including this one. Some people in the United States say it was a 20-year war. 20 years is long enough. You just said, well, the brunt of the war was being fought by the Afghan army. We had 2,500 non-combatant troops there. NATO had, 6,000 to 7,000 troops there. We hadn't lost an American soldier in 18 months. Is it really to be considered a 20-year war, or conversely? Now what's happened? A 20-year war, so-called? Is it not now a 30-year war, 40-year war, 50-year war, given what's taken place in Afghanistan? I'd be curious about your answer to that, and your answer about how this changes the entire structure of our national security. NATO, Britain, empowers China, the threats to Pakistan and so forth that we now have in store for the free world. We'll be right back.
So when in doubt, just say, let me talk to my manager.
Next, Carvana's 100% online shop.
Welcome back, America. We're back with retired Colonel Richard Kemp. Among his many career stop-offs was Afghanistan as commander of British forces. Colonel Kemp, my question to you is, given what's taken place now in Afghanistan and it's ongoing, and assuming that Joe Biden stays on the same course, what are the consequences for the United States, Britain, NATO, the free world, and that area of the world now?
I think the consequences of what's just happened and what's still happening are absolutely devastating for the whole of the Western world. I mentioned earlier the catastrophic effect on NATO. NATO is a very important military alliance. Many presidents have criticised it for not pulling its weight, of the European member states in particular, and they're right to do so. But President Biden has just completely destroyed its credibility, totally destroyed it. And we're seeing what we face now is a terrorist threat coming out of Afghanistan that is greater than the terrorist threat before 9/11. Jihadists around the world have been celebrating the events, and not least the president, not that he's a jihadist, but the president of Pakistan, Imran Khan, who himself celebrated it. It should be celebrated. Pakistan significantly funded the Taliban throughout the campaign, while at the same time being paid vast amounts of money by America and Britain. But they're celebrating around the world. Hamas in Gaza are celebrating what's happening here. And they will be re-energized. They will see that their recruitment has been boosted. They will be reinvigorated, and they will launch attacks around the world against our countries, as they did really when they were being inspired by the Islamic State. Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State are strong in Afghanistan at the moment. Al-Qaeda fought alongside the Taliban in recent battles. They will operate freely. Doesn't matter what the Taliban say to you. They will allow the Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State to operate freely there. And they can operate more freely than they could before 9/11 because they know there's no fear of Western intervention now. That's finished. That's history. That's not going to happen again. They know that, and so they'll be even bolder than before. And jihadists from around the world will flock into Afghanistan to train, prepare, and launch attacks against the West. So the state of the terrorist threat is higher than it was at the height of the Islamic State's power when they controlled large parts of Syria and of Iraq. That's just one aspect of the situation. There's no one really who is celebrating this situation more than Russia and China. They're the greatest cheerleaders for what's happened. They've helped to bring it about, but they now will be emboldened themselves. They've done a great deal against the West, a huge amount against the West in the past. They now will look at the deterrent that the United States used to present, and they will see that they've got pretty much an open field to do almost whatever they like. And those countries that we had hoped to entice onto our side into the Western sphere, those countries will say, why would we do that? These people are clearly fair weather friends. We can't rely on them. We can't trust them. And they will see Russia and China as being the more reliable ally than any country in the West. And so that will be extremely damaging for our ability to wield power. And yet that was one of the reasons that President Biden gave for pulling out of Afghanistan, that he would focus more effort, he'd be able to focus more effort on confronting China and Russia. Well, this is completely the reverse of what he expected to happen. There's so many other implications that I could go through. I won't go through them all because I think those are probably the most severe implications. We're going to see China holding the upper hand over Afghanistan now, together with Pakistan, and they will use their influence together with Russia and Iran in Afghanistan. They will use that influence not only to enrich themselves by plundering Afghanistani minerals and resources, but by using what they have there to hit against the West. So the whole world just became vastly more dangerous. The US government, President Biden humiliated the United States. He humiliated the United States Army. In my opinion, and I don't say this lightly, and I've never said it about anybody else, any other leader in this position, people have been talking about impeaching President Biden. I don't believe President Biden should be impeached. He's the commander-in-chief of the US Armed Forces, who's just essentially surrendered to the Taliban. He shouldn't be impeached. He should be court-martialed for betraying the United States of America and the United States Armed Forces.
Now, Colonel Kemp, I want to ask you a couple of questions here. If you're Taiwan now, or you're Ukraine, dealing with Russia, or you're Israel, dealing with Iran and a whole host of terrorists, and you've been relying on the United States as an ally, you have a lot to worry about now, don't you?
You have a lot to worry about, and the president of Taiwan made a statement in which she said that that we now need, in the light of what's been going on in Afghanistan, we need now to look at strengthening our own defensive efforts. And that's very telling in itself. Of course, they should be defending themselves, but they are not capable of defending themselves against China. They do need the United States, and they're now wondering if they've got the United States. The same applies for, as you say, for Ukraine. Ukraine is in grave danger. Israel, other Gulf states in the Middle East are in grave danger, because not only has President Biden surrendered to the Taliban, he's also been appeasing Iran and encouraging Iran to get back into the nuclear deal that threatens all countries in the Middle East and that has led to an arms race in the Middle East. And those countries are not any longer relying on the US. They can't rely on the United States. And so I think there's it leads us to a very, very shaky and unstable situation, because they recognize that Iran, as much as they're afraid, Iran is emboldened. Iran has interests in Afghanistan anyway, but they're also emboldened by the weakness they've seen in the United States. And that will encourage them to be even more aggressive in the region. They will demand more on the JCPOA and the nuclear deal. They will push harder to destroy Israel by setting up bases of attack in Syria, by reinforcing their presence in Lebanon. They will be working harder yet against Saudi Arabia, which they've been at war with, a proxy war via Yemen, and they will re-energize their aggression across the region. We will see great danger from Iran, as well as other countries that are no longer deterred by the United States.
We'll be right back.
Across the region, we will see great danger from Iran, as well as other countries that are no longer deterred by the United States.
We'll be right back. Welcome back, Colonel Richard Kemp. My question to you is it's a very grave one. Is America in the decline? Can America come back? Is China on the rise? What do you make of all this?
Before I answer that question, I'd like to say also that I don't think America alone is responsible for the situation. I think European countries also share a degree of the blame. I think President Biden should take most of the responsibility for this. But there are other sovereign states who are powerful, including Britain, in Europe, who could and should have played their own role more strongly, and who could have influenced, perhaps, or certainly should have tried to influence President Biden in his decision. So it's not America alone. I think America is to blame, but there's also a huge amount of responsibility on Britain's shoulders, for example. In terms of the decline of the United States, I think we've seen a settled world order since 1945, pretty much. Okay, we've had many conflicts since then, but pretty much the world order has been largely settled. Obviously, we saw shifting dynamics in relation to communist Russia, the Soviet Union, but the situation has been stable, and we've got used to, I think, a world of increasing prosperity, a world of great stability for pretty much every country in the West, including the US, and therefore we find it kind of inconceivable that that's going to be shaken, that's going to be changed. And people talk about the threats of climate change, the threats from coronavirus, and all the rest of it. But I believe that the threat from the actions of the United States in this situation has been far more consequential than either of those problems, because I do believe that that not only are we seeing a United States now, we're seeing a United States about to go into deep decline internationally after this. China was already clawing its way up, and we were allowing it to. We were kind of asleep at the wheel while it was happening, not only America, but European countries as well. We were allowing it to claw its way up onto the top, on the back of our technology, of our education, of our financial resources, and that's exactly what they've been doing. But now we potentially face a situation where China actually does come out on top and America descends and ends up under the domination of China. I don't think that's completely out of the question. I think that could happen. But we need to regain the situation. The situation can be regained. I mentioned before that it took 15 years from Saigon in '75 until the first Gulf War to regain America's status in the world. And I think this is a great deal worse than that. So it could take several decades to recover from this, but recover we must, and we must do it as quickly as possible. And I think, America is, in my opinion, America is the greatest country in the world. And America cannot afford, the world cannot afford for that status and that position of leadership and all the good it's done around the world, decade after decade. I don't think we can allow that to go. So it's obviously the action resulting from this is obviously a decision for the United States of America. But I, as a Brit, would certainly encourage the people in the United States of America to turn this situation around. And you ain't going to turn it round with the people at the helm who are there now.
And that's the thing the American people need to comprehend, and half of the country does and half of the country doesn't, which is Biden is president of the United States. The leadership of the Democrat Party runs the Congress. They pick the generals. They pick the national security advisors. They pick the Secretary of State. Domestically, they make the decisions on open borders, on whether they embrace capitalism or a form of Marxism. And a country that bleeds from within is going to bleed from without too. People who make bad decisions internally make bad decisions externally. And if you don't believe in the United States of America here at home, you sure as hell aren't going to believe in the strength and the morals of the United States of America abroad. General, you should have been a general. Colonel Kemp, I want to thank you very, very much for coming on the program, for your war against terror and your war for freedom, and your support, of course, of Britain and NATO, and especially the United States. God bless you, my friend.
Thank you very much.
We'll be right back.
Out, NATO is nowhere. And I think all of these things and many other